To all the pawnbrokers, wooden drapers, piece brokers, carpenters, and locksmiths, etc., in Great Britain and Ireland. You are hereby desired to accompany your worthy friend, the famous Mr. John Shephard, from his seat at Newgate to the Triple Tree, where he is to make his last exit. His corpse to be carried from thence and decently interred among his ancestors. Pray bring this ticket with you.
Jack Shephard's hanging drew the largest crowd that London had ever seen.
Oh, the shark had pretty teeth, dear, and he shows them pearly white. Just a jackknife has Macheath, dear.
The man they came to see was a pale 22-year-old youth who spoke with a stutter. An unlikely criminal, an even more unlikely hero. Yet the king owned portraits of him. He inspired John Gay to write The Beggar's Opera. Defoe wrote about his life. If the 18th century could be said to have a superstar, Jack was it. Although some of the crowd had come to see him hang, still more came hoping to see him dodge the noose. Because if anyone could escape the inevitable, it was the boy who was the blueprint for Mac the Knife, the original Jack the Lad.
Losing life, someone sneaking round the corner. Could that someone perhaps perchance be Mac the Knife? From a tugboat on the river going slow.
The week he went to hang, Jack gave his final confession to the chaplain of Newgate Prison. Known as the Ordinary, the chaplain was on a nice little earner, selling the last words of convicted prisoners. How much of what he wrote was really Jack's own words we'll never know, but the memoirs survive.
My father was a... If my birth and parentage and education may serve of service and satisfaction to mankind, I was born in Stepney parish the year Queen Anne came to the crown. And my father was a carpenter by trade.
The Ordinary's tale was a bestseller, a story that took Jack to the heights of celebrity from very humble beginnings. His mother was widowed before Jack was 6, so she became a servant to William Kneebone, a draper in the Strand. Jack was sent to the workhouse. Like many of London's poor children, he spent years in the workhouse, unpaid. He was then apprenticed to a carpenter, bound for 7 years while he learned his trade, unpaid again. Apprentice boys were widely seen as nature's hooligans, born to be hanged. Between 1700 and 1725, nearly half of those hanged at Tyburn were apprentice boys.
Many young apprentices have some sort of involvement in crime, whether they are actually going out and stealing of somebody or whether they're doing a bit of petty pilfering from their workplace or from their master. But many of them grow out of it and move on. But some people, and Jack was one of those, you know, they clearly develop a taste for it. You know, he makes a choice.
As an apprentice, Jack was 21 and still not allowed out of his master's house at night. In theory, at least.
I made a mere jest of the locks and bolts and entered in and out at pleasure.
No matter how many times he was locked out, Jack was always in his bed in the morning. But typically for an 18th century boy, Jack never strayed far from his patch.
Because it was a very small-scale world, we noticed Jack doesn't move too much about London. He knows his square mile and that's about it.
You think of people today being able to really transcend where they were born if they've got the talent and the tenacity to do it. There wasn't the social fluidity for him to do that.
London's poor were stuck in one area, and in Jack's case, that meant he was stuck in the heart of London's underworld.
Around Covent Garden, where he was brought up, it's full of whorehouses ranging from kind of threepenny uprights to, 250 quid a night courtesans. So it was all around him, this kind of sense of chaos and an enormous amount of consumption which he had no access to.
I lay the blame for my eternal ruin on the Black Lion Ale House in Drury Lane.
His local pub, the Black Lion in Drury Lane, was a favourite spot for criminals and prostitutes. Beer was fourpence a quart. Enough gin to get drunk cost twopence. A night with a cheap prostitute cost the same.
This wicked house and Bess brought me to a train of vices.
It was Bess, Edgeworth Bess to her friends, who changed Jack's life forever.
Blousy Bess was a great big jolly bouncing girl who she was a buttock and file, which is a buttock was a whore and a file was a thief, and a buttock and file was a whore who'd nick your purse while you were doing it with her. And she encouraged him to crime, I think. He attributes all his life of crime to her, that she wanted frocks and drinks and necklaces, and so that's why he started stealing. It's much easier to blame it on a scarlet woman.
So that summer,
'Twas about the latter end of July, 1723.
Jack began to steal. He'd become a thief. And so, with cash in his pocket for the first time in his life, Jack quit his apprenticeship. He'd only 8 months of his 7 years to serve. Jack and Bess moved to Piccadilly, living the good life on the profits of his petty crime, stealing and selling the odd spoon or a bit of cloth. As a thief, he made more money in a month than a carpenter made in a year. And Jack wasn't alone in preferring thieving to hard work. The early 18th century was a boom time for casual burglary. There was just that much more to steal.
the actual possibilities of theft are simply much greater in the early 18th century than they have been before. And the number of people who actually have money to spend on things that they don't strictly need is growing all the time. People are excited by the new sort of luxury possessions that they might have. And in a way, you might say a thief is somebody who just gets improperly excited.
More property meant more theft, and more thieves meant there were thief catchers. It was only a matter of time before Jack attracted the attention of the law. Long before there was a police force on the streets of London, Jonathan Wild, the self-appointed thief-taker general, was the law. He stood to gain £40 for every criminal he brought to the gallows, enough to keep a gentleman in some style. And Jack was an attractive catch. But Wild did offer an alternative, which was to work for him. Because as well as running the law enforcement of London, Wild also ran all the crime. As Jack later observed,
I have often lamented the scandalous practice of thief-catching. The thief-catcher, living sumptuously, deserves the gallows as richly as any of the thieves.
Wild's very clever. He's very much part of a sort of hardened world of serious crime. It's suggested that he actually had warehouses full of goods down on the Thames that he exported over to the continent. You know, we are talking about something that is much more familiar as organised crime.
Now Wild was keen to be seen as a legitimate businessman. He forced members of his gang to dress finely and hired a dance instructor to teach them the formal courtly dances of the day. As for his personal life, there are few details. It is known that he removed his wife's ear with a knife. He was a ruthless enemy.
When Shephard initially attracted the attention of Wild, it was because Wild wanted him to work for him. He didn't like the thought of somebody, a thief, being successful in London and out of his corporation of thieves, as he called it.
He complimented me on my successes, said he heard that I had both an and an ed, admirably turned to business, and that I should be welcome to him.
But Jack never liked authority of any kind. He refused Wild's offer, and from that moment on, he was never safe. Without Wild's protection, Jack was fair game for any bounty hunter. James Sykes, alias Helen Fury, lured Jack to the pub for a game of skittles. The game was a trap. Jack was arrested. He was confined to the top floor of the nearest jail, a low-security lockup in St Giles. This was his first brush with prison. If he'd stayed there, waiting for his trial, perhaps no one would ever have heard of him.
I had nothing but an old razor in my pocket and was confined in the upper part of the place, being 2 stories from the ground. With my razor, I cut out the stretcher of a chair and began to make a breaching in the roof, laying the feather bed under it to prevent any noise from the rubbish falling on the floor.
Shake it,
he'd escaped before, but not many people made their way through the ceiling of a prison. He saw an opportunity. The roof happened to be not in good repair, and because he was a carpenter, he knew that it would be easy to break through that masonry.
There he goes, behind the chimney.
And when he got down onto the ground, he rushed into the crowd, or he got into the crowd, without anybody knowing who it was, and he pointed up at the ceiling and said, "Look, look, look, I think I see him by the chimney." And this huge crowd kind of swelled around, looking out for this hero escaping.
And just like that, he was gone. He'd spent less than 3 hours in jail. By May 1724, Jack was a footpad, working the streets and fields around central London. The more his mother and Mr. Kneebone pleaded with him to stop, the more brazen Jack became. Jack saw a scuffle between a gentleman and a pickpocket over a gold watch. His recklessness did him little good. He was quickly caught. He was fantastic at getting out of prison, but useless at staying out. And that night, he was back behind bars. Bess wasn't much better at staying out either. The next morning, she visited Jack with a file to help him escape. The file was discovered and she was arrested too. At least, being regarded as man and wife, they were allowed to share a cell.
18th century prisons were basically holding tanks. They were places to keep prisoners until the trial occurred so that you could ensure that the prisoner was there when it was time for the trial. They were not about trying to reform prisoners.
Jack didn't sit around waiting for his court date. The window of the cell was barred by a thick oak beam. Jack's training as a carpenter's apprentice served him well once again. By boring tiny holes close together at either end of the beam, he weakened it enough to allow him to break through. With the way free, a window was no obstacle to Jack, but he was still on the second floor. And there was another problem. Though Jack had escaped from heights before, using sheets and blankets, this time he had a passenger. Jack made a reinforced rope out of Bess's clothes, but they weren't free yet. The new prison was built next to the Bridewell. They'd only escaped from one jail into the yard of another. Surrounded by a 22-foot brick wall topped with spikes, Jack and Bess seemed trapped. The gate was reinforced with iron bolts. Jack reckoned that using the bolts as footholds, he could scramble up, but the bolts only went halfway up the gate. Only by stabbing the gimlet into the gate and hauling himself up could Jack reach the top. Sometimes it pays to be only 5'4" and slender. And sometimes it doesn't. But even though he was small, he was strong. In the darkness, avoiding the attention of the prison guards, Jack pulled Bess over the gate. Jack Shephard, prison breaker, was building quite a reputation. Now well known in the criminal world, Jack found himself a new accomplice. Blueskin Blake had also had a brush with Jonathan Wild. When Wild had him arrested, Blueskin resisted. His reward was a cut across the face with a sabre. Now they were out of jail, Jack and Blueskin became a team. Their ambitions were pretty limited. They tried their hands at highway robbery, but failed. So they went back home, and before long, they were stealing again. They even stole from the one person who'd been kind to Jack. His former master, William Kneebone. Kneebone immediately suspected Jack.
He was a known felon, and because he was a suspicious character and he had a track record, and all the neighbours knew it. And this is the world, of course, in which, therefore, the informer and the thief-taker, like Jonathan Wild, would be able to operate most effectively.
Hurt by Jack's treachery, Kneebone contacted Jonathan Wild. And Wild knew how to get to Jack. Through Bess.
Carrying Bess over the wall of Bridewell Yard was not so wonderful. She indeed rewarded me well for it, betraying me to Jonathan Wild.
Bess pointed Wild to Blueskin's mother's brandy shop.
God forgive her. I do.
Back in prison for the third time in quick succession, Jack Shephard first made the papers.
And yesterday, one Shephard, a notorious housebreaker who lately escaped from New Prison, was committed to Newgate Jail, having been retaken by Jonathan Wild.
Jack was starting to attract attention all over town.
At the time we're talking about, around the early 1720s, we see the invention of what we now think of as celebrity. People became famous not for great works or important deeds, but for being personalities, for being in the public eye. And they were made in the public eye by the huge growth of periodical publication. Magazines which were accessible, which were widely disseminated, cheap, easily read materials.
And true crime stories were at the heart of the newspaper culture. The best crime reporter in London was Daniel Defoe, and he wrote Jack's story for his boss, John Appleby, the tabloid proprietor of his day.
Men like John Appleby would have been regarded as feeding very low appetites, and a man like Appleby was quite characteristic in having his finger in several pies, in publishing books, prose narratives, publishing also very cheap publications like The Ordinary of Newgate's accounts of the last confessions of criminals.
While the world outside was reading with interest about his escapades, Jack Shephard finally made it to trial. The Sessions House at the Old Bailey was a peculiar building with only 3 walls. In what seems like an unfair arrangement, while the judge and jury were inside the building, the criminals awaiting trial were open to the elements.
The reason for this was that in an earlier sessions, prisoners had brought typhus, what was called jail fever at the time, had brought it into the courtroom and had actually infected large numbers of the jury and the judges.
Jack was called to the bar, literally a wooden bar that divided the accused from the judge and jury. He didn't have long to try and save his neck.
At the Old Bailey in the 18th century, there were often 15 to 20 trials a day. Trials therefore only lasted perhaps half an hour. And in that half hour, the evidence for the prosecution, the case for the defense, everything was made in that short period of time, and the fate of the prisoner was decided.
Jonathan Wild and William Kneebone both gave evidence against Jack, which was written down verbatim by the court and published. The public's love of true crime meant that they wanted to hear every word of the trial too.
The prisoner hath sometime since been in my service. On 12th of July last, at about 11 o'clock at night, I saw all my doors and windows made fast, and then went to bed. I was called up at about 4 in the morning and found my house broke open. The bar of my cellar window was cut. The bolts of my cellar door were drawn back, and the padlock wrenched off. The shutters in my shop were broke, and 108 yards of woolen cloth, 2 silver spoons, and other things were taken away. I presently suspected the prisoner because he had lately caused some ill actions in the neighbourhood, and acquainting Jonathan Wild with it, by his means the prisoner was apprehended and committed to the new prison. I went to see him there and asked him how he could be so ungrateful as to rob me after I had shown him so much kindness. He confessed that he had been very ungrateful in doing so, but said that he had been drawn into it by ill company.
Jonathan Wild was next on the stand. He wouldn't receive his £40 reward until Jack was convicted and hanged.
The prosecutor told me that he suspected the prisoner and desired me to inquire after the goods. I promised to do him all the service I could, and accordingly, understanding that the prisoner was acquainted with Joseph Blake, alias Blueskin, and William Field, I sent for Field, who on coming I told him that if he would make an ingenious confession, I could prevail on the court to admit him as evidence.
William Field was Wild's key witness in the trial, even though he had nothing to do with the case. Perjury was well known at the Old Bailey. It was common for men to wait outside, offering to perjure themselves for a price. They advertised their services with a piece of straw in their shoe. And as professional witnesses were willing to lie under oath for money. They were known as straw men.
The prisoner told me and Blueskin that he knew of this Kenworth milling. Well, that's a house worth breaking, because there was something good to be got in it. And so he carried us to view the prosecutor's house. Blueskin and I disapproved. Didn't think it could be done that easily. Yet, the prisoner said it could be done with all the places in life, because he lived with the prosecutor and was acquainted with every part of the house. And would undertake the task himself. All we had to do was stand where we were to keep a good lookout.
We agreed to this, and he cut the bar out of the cellar window and got into the shop, brought out 3 pounds of cloth, which we carried away.
It just wasn't true. Though Jack had stolen from Kneebone, Field had not been there. He was a fence and had only heard tales of the crime. Though Jack eventually confessed all his other crimes, he swore that Field was lying until the day he died.
When Shephard was tried, there were no lawyers. The defendant simply had to conduct his own defense. And with Field's evidence, it was very hard to know how to deny it without admitting that he'd been present at the offense. Whereas if he'd had a lawyer, then of course the lawyer probably could have torn apart Field's testimony. But Shephard was not in a position to do that.
Even though the prosecution testimony is recorded verbatim and still survives today, Jack's response was not published. So, we have to rely on his confession, in which he recalled that he attacked Field's credibility as a witness.
William Field is an old offender, a frequent attendant at the bar, a subtle seducer of unwary youths like myself, and an encourager of all the fatal practices that procure ruin.
But there was nothing he could do. The jury, made up of local men of property, had all heard of Jack and his reputation.
Unlike today, where you would be disqualified if you knew anything about a case or about a person before you sat on the trial, then actually that knowledge was expected, and the jurors could bring that knowledge to the trial.
They found him guilty. He pleaded for mercy. He begged earnestly for transportation to the Americas, anything but death. In the 18th century, hanging was a possible punishment for very minor offences. Anyone stealing turnips, impersonating a pensioner of Greenwich Hospital, or going on a public highway with a sooty face could, in theory, be executed. But in practice, even once they were found guilty, the jury could still save them from the gallows.
There was a huge element of discretion, which meant that the chances of someone escaping the noose were very high indeed. The jury might decide to consider the crime less serious than it actually was, to give the chap a chance. A boy like Jack, however, of course, had none of that going for him. He'd done it too often, he was too famous. To let him off the noose as a working person's hero would be, of course, to undermine the authority of the law itself.
Jack's notoriety worked against him. The hangman tied his thumbs together. This meant that for the crime of robbing his former master of a roll of cloth, Jack would hang. Jack was taken to the condemned hold at Newgate Prison. The worst accommodation that 18th century London had to offer. He was on death row. The prison was a rabbit warren of cells and dungeons 5 stories high. Known for its terrible sanitary conditions, many of those who entered died before they could be freed or hanged. Contemporary descriptions say that the floor was so ridden with lice that there was a crunching sound as you walked. The men and women in death row were all scheduled to hang in late August. The prisoners were known to spend their time holding mock trials. Among the prisoners, Abraham Duval had forged a winning lottery ticket. Anthony Upton was a burglar. Blueskin, Jack's friend and accomplice, was waiting for his trial for the Kneebone robbery. Lumley Davis was a highwayman.
The people hanged were almost exclusively working class young men, some women, but the vast majority of them were humble people like Jack himself. Their crimes very often quite petty, usually against property. So it's a working class experience, the noose.
As the execution date grew nearer, the prisoners prayed their names wouldn't appear on the dead warrant. But there was no reprieve for Anthony Upton, Lumley Davis or Jack. Lumley Davis had successfully smuggled in a file and offered it to the celebrity prison breaker. Jack later told the Ordinary,
"I'd rather have a file than all the mines of Mexico."
In broad daylight, Jack was visited by Edgeworth Bess and Poll Maggot, another prostitute. By all accounts, Bess wanted to make up for betraying Jack to Wilde. A few hours later, they left. Then, a few minutes after that, Poll Maggot left again. The story of Jack's escape from Newgate was all over the newspapers. The public wanted to know how he'd broken out again. After all, the turnkeys were known for their vigilance. So how did it happen? Bess pretended to talk to Jack while Jack, out of the turnkey's line of vision, soared through the spike above his cell door. He dressed in clothes that Bess had brought him. While Poll hid, Jack took her place. With Jack dressed in Poll's coat, he and Bess left. The dress covered the fetters, still around his ankles but silenced with cloth. And by the time Poll left the prison, Jack was long gone.
He just walked out dressed as a woman. I mean, it's absolutely the most audacious escape, the most audacious of his escapes in many ways, because he was walking out right under the noses of his turnkeys.
Jack should have been on the run, hiding out. But a week after he'd escaped from Newgate, he was up to his old tricks. Dressed as a butcher, he walked right past the gate of the jail and robbed a watchmaker's. Jonathan Wilde's men were hunting him everywhere. As well as the money, Wilde had his reputation at stake, and Shephard had begun to make him a laughingstock. He was finally tracked down hiding in a haystack on Finchley Common. And Jack found himself in Newgate once again.
The number of times he escapes means that the newspapers carry his story for a long period, and that generates a lot of interest in him. But also, of course, after one of his recaptures, he actually becomes a sort of tourist attraction. People can visit him, and he seems, as far as one can tell, fairly sort of content that they should do.
The warders were in no rush to see Jack hanged, because he was making them a small fortune in visitors' fees. So they were relieved when it became clear that Jack couldn't be executed until after the next sessions of the Old Bailey.
Saw in Newgate John Shephard, the famous thief who had escaped so often out of prison. Cost me 3 and 6pence to see the rascal.
Jack was a peculiar case because he was an escaper, and the quality of defiance that was carried by these escapes was something that was immensely attractive to a plebeian world that was simply caught in a world that was full of prisons. People's lives were imprisoned really by the square miles they lived in, as Jack's story itself shows. Someone who could cock a snook at this tremendous system of control that was written out in the architecture of the city was inevitably going to be a hero.
One morning they came in and saw him walking around in his cell absolutely free, and he'd just taken his chains off to show them that he could do it. So you get the sense definitely that he's bought into this kind of new image of himself that he's made. And in that sense, he's like a modern celebrity as well.
The warders increased Jack's load. They chained him down with the heaviest weights they could find. They chained his feet to a staple in the floor and put on 2 sets of fetters. Meanwhile, at the Old Bailey, Jack's partner in crime, Blueskin Blake, waited for his half-hour trial. Needless to say, Jonathan Wilde was present, waiting to collect another £40. Blueskin, terrified of the gallows, asked Wilde if he could put in a good word.
And Wilde said, "I believe you must die. I'll send you a good book or two and provide you with a coffin. And you shall not be anatomized."
Not being cut up for medical experiments was little comfort to Blueskin. He pulled a blunt penknife and slit Wilde's throat. While Wilde was treated, Blueskin was, of course, sentenced to death. Unless Jack could somehow escape, the two friends would hang together. But Jack was in Newgate's maximum security cell, known affectionately as the Castle. It was on the 3rd floor, with no direct access to the roof. No way up, no way down. The turnkeys had searched his cell and confiscated the tools that had been smuggled to him by his adoring public. They found nails, files, and even a saw. And he was back to square one. Except for one thing. Now the sessions were on, the turnkeys were busy ferrying dozens of prisoners backwards and forwards to the Old Bailey. They would have less time to watch the convicts. Jack knew it was now or never. The equation was simple. Escape or hang.
The 4th escape is incredible because not only does he escape once, twice, 3 times, he escapes actually. There's 15 elements to this escape.
Thursday, the 15th of October, 2 p.m. A routine visit from the turnkey on duty, William Austin.
I asked him to come again to me the same evening, but I neither desired nor expected his company.
Gambling that the turnkey wouldn't come back, Jack made his move. An exact representation of his progress that night was recorded in minute detail by the official investigation that followed. The first task was the handcuffs. With his hands free, he worked on the horse padlock at his feet.
Locks in the early 18th century were very different to anything that's available today. The basic mechanism had been more or less unchanged since Roman times, and none of the major technical improvements had taken place. They only came in 1780s, and from then on. All the security was dependent on what's called a ward within the lock. A ward is a fixed obstruction within the lock that can vary in complexity enormously. With a simpler lock, such as a padlock, even a simple hook-shaped pick could have been enough to pass the wards and open the lock.
But he was still bound to the floor by the ankle fetters. Using the stronger metal of the open padlock as a lever, he prized apart one of the links of the chain. Now able to walk, Jack tied the fetters around his ankles with his stockings so they wouldn't drag and rattle.
He wouldn't have used the time to actually break from the cuffs on the legs or anything like that. Just the basics, which is split open the chain so they had freedom to move his legs as well.
The question was, which way to go? Jack was on the third floor. There was no way down without running into the turnkeys moving prisoners back and forth from the Old Bailey. The only way was up the chimney.
But the chimney is blocked by an iron bar. I think he could have saved himself time here by loosening the bar the days that he was in there beforehand.
But he still had to smash his way through the bricks of the chimney. The falling rubble made a racket, but the investigation reported that Jack used his old trick of muffling the noise with his mattress so that it couldn't be heard 3 floors down. Now he was on the top floor. Between Jack and freedom was a maze of corridors. It would mean breaking through 6 separate locked doors. Night had fallen. The room he entered was pitch black.
The locks Jack would have encountered in Newgate would have been very different to anything he would have come across during housebreaking. They were almost certainly much more robust, very heavy steel-cased locks. And more importantly than that, there would have been no keyhole on the inside of the door.
He had to use the nail to force aside the plate that covered the lockbox. Jack claimed it took only 7 minutes to shoot back the lock. Into the empty corridor, Jack was faced with more choices. The staircase ran down to the floor he'd come from, and from there He knew the way to the main gate would mean passing the cells and the turnkeys. He had to make for the roof. Jack turned his attention to the locked door of the chapel. He'd proven himself a master of lockpicking, but this was no help with the chapel door, because it wasn't fitted with a lock. It was a solid wooden door, bolted shut from the other side. In despair, Jack threw the iron bar at the door and missed. He knew there was a way. Not through the door, but round it. It would be noisy, but the guards were busy down below.
We think of it now as a kind of maximum security jail, but it was partly open in the evenings. Criminals, apart from those condemned to death, could come and go. Criminals could move around, mix together quite freely, male and female, young and old. So it was not like our modern regimented prisons. It was a much more unruly place.
Jack was working for his life. Eventually, he was able to force his hand and wrist through the rough hole. The chapel was a larger room, more than 30 feet square, with pens for the prisoners divided by rows of spikes. But now Jack had a new problem. An immense wooden door, strengthened with 4 broad metal bands. Iron hasps and bolts fastened an iron lockbox. And worst of all, a broad iron bar 7 feet long and 2 inches thick held the whole door to the doorpost.
Coming up against locks like this, where he had no access to the mechanism, and even if he did, with the tools at his disposal, he would not have been able to pick the lock. The only way he could defeat such locks was through sheer brute force, forcing them from the doors or destroying the keeps. It was the only way to get past them.
Jack knew he was close. The air of London was just inches away, the other side of that one door. Having come so far, Jack wasn't going to quit now.
Locks like this were designed to take abuse and to take punishment. To wrench the lock off of the door would have taken a good deal of resource and a great deal of desperation, as well as a huge amount of physical strength. It must have been an incredible feat.
Just think about it. Your soul is crying out, I just want to live. Like a madman, something starts to take over. He can smell freedom. Like a performer, I don't care who you are, when you've got the last few minutes and that you're ready to make your escape and you've only got a few minutes and that, you know, you're fighting for life. And this is what Jack was doing. He would have been crazy. He would have been literally pulling at the door to break free.
And Jack also had luck. When the bar came away, the iron hasps and fastenings came with it. There was no time to breathe in the air of London. He climbed up the door and ran across the roof to where the houses began. But his problems were far from over. 30 feet below him were the roofs of the neighbouring houses. The fall would either kill him or the fetters would snap his ankles when he landed. Jack knew the solution to this problem. He'd escaped from enough prison roofs by now to know what he needed to do. But he had come all this way without his sheet. Jack knew he had to go back. He had to retrace his steps, return to his cell and fetch his sheet. Each door Jack passed was exactly as he'd left it. As he silently followed his own path through the prison, he must have imagined a turnkey round every corner. The rubble in his cell was undisturbed. As quickly as he could, Jack raced back to the roof. He needed 15 feet of rope to make the drop safe. And within a few minutes, he landed on the roof of a Mr. Bird's house in Newgate Street. He'd come too far to be stuck on the roof until it was light. When he saw a maid open the front door, he simply barreled down the stairs and charged out of the house. Jack ran the rest of the night, as far as the countryside at Tottenham. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Jack was fast asleep in a cowshed. And William Austin, the turnkey responsible for Jack's secure incarceration, went to say good morning to his celebrity prisoner. But Jack wasn't there. The great escape from Newgate was big news.
John Shephard did break out of Newgate in the night between the 15th and 16th of October, with double irons on his legs and handcuffs on his hands, with a bright horse lock under his other irons.
On the run, Jack had never been more popular, and never been more alone. Despite his fame, he was still a poor boy from the streets of London. He was a long way from home. And despite his bad habit of getting caught every time he went back to London, on the 29th of October, that's exactly what he did. Bess was in jail for assisting with his previous escape, so he had to look elsewhere for company.
What did you do next? You sent for a sober young woman who for a long time past had been the true mistress of your affections.
But the truth is, he sent for 2 prostitutes, both named Kate. Seeing a fashionable set of clothes in the window of a pawnbroker's, he'd robbed the premises and left wearing a new black suit, a gold watch, a tie wig, a ruffled shirt, a new sword and a diamond ring. And hiding out in a garret in Newport Market with 2 prostitutes, Jack found ways of passing the time. While he was in hiding, he was safe. But that wasn't Jack's style. London's most wanted man got dressed up to the nines and went on a pub crawl.
He is about 22 years of age, about 5'4" high, very slender, of a pale complexion, has an impediment or hesitation in his speech. Whoever will discover or apprehend him, so that he be brought to justice, shall have 20 guineas reward.
The bounty was too much of a temptation for the daughter of the landlord of the Rose and Crown. Back in his cell, he was under constant guard and on permanent show. His public wanted him to perform. Even the Lord Chancellor wanted to meet him. The Chancellor was as intrigued by the young prison breaker as everyone else. Perhaps because he had some experience of criminal activity himself. Despite being paid £14,000 on taking up office and receiving £4 grand a year tax-free, he was embezzling from the Chancery Court funds.
The wealthy, of course, committed their own offences, but those kinds of offences, fraud, various kinds of, dodgy business dealings and so forth, would be dealt with, if they were dealt with at all, in different courts, according to, in the civil courts, where the legal system was very different. You could not be hanged for the kinds of offences committed by the rich unless they decided to engage in treason.
While Jack had stolen some cloth, the Lord Chancellor was found guilty of accepting bribes of over £100,000. His sentence was a fine of £30,000, which he paid easily. In fact, some of it was paid by his friend, the King. Not that the King had failed to notice Jack and the unrest he might be stirring up amongst the poor. His Majesty, being informed of the extraordinary escapes that John Shephard has twice made out of Newgate, and how very dangerous a person he is, has commanded that execution may, without delay, be awarded against him. The king wanted Jack dead fast, but not so fast that he didn't have time to get a portrait of the young tearaway. In his cell, Jack had to pose for the court painter, and once the king had ordered 2 copies of the portrait, Jack could hang. While Jack had been busy, the noose had already claimed his friend Blueskin. Blueskin died an ignominious death. Gone to pieces with drink and fear, he had hanged until he strangled.
It was a very inefficient way of killing a man, especially in a world where there was no calculation about the length of the drop that was required to break the spine. As a matter of course, nearly everybody who was hanged choked for minutes, sometimes for an awesome number of minutes. The choking was audible to the crowd. There would be a hush as he dropped. He'd kick, his face would go purple. He'd wet his pants, he'd defecate, as like as not. And you probably don't want to know that he'd get an erection, and ejaculate too. Of course, it was helpful to have members of the family at the foot of the scaffold, friends, to pull on your legs as they kicked and kicked and kicked in order to get it over with as quickly as possible.
The day came. Normally, the hanging days were public holidays, scheduled weeks in advance, and up to 24 victims were hanged together. For Jack, a one-off day was speedily arranged. He would die alone. The route from Newgate in the city to the gallows at Tyburn was 2.5 miles long. Lining it was the biggest street party London had ever seen. And at the centre of it all was Jack.
Oh, the shark had pretty teeth, dear. He shows them pearly white, just a jackknife has Mackie.
The streets were mobbed with the working men and women of London, cheering and shouting for their hero. Perhaps they hoped that Jack could pull off the greatest escape of his career and cheat the hangman at the very last minute. It's certainly true that Jack's death was by no means a foregone conclusion. A group of powerful men had organised a daring escape from the gallows. Chief among the conspirators was said to be the tabloid proprietor John Appleby, a man who had in recent weeks made a fortune selling his paper with Jack's story in it every day. If Jack were to live, the story would run and run.
The theory is that Defoe and Appleby, the publisher, offered him a deal in return for his story, that they would help him to escape from the gallows. In the moment between life and death, his body would be cut down when it was still alive, and he would be taken off, whisked off to a nearby house where he would be revived.
Jack was informed of the plan on the road to Tyburn.
He went through the streets knowing that at the gallows, death was one side of what waited for him, but the other side of it was potential escape. So he must have felt this kind of combination of fear and anticipation and excitement again. I mean, was this going to be his greatest escape yet?
If this really was to be Jack's greatest escape, it would be in front of a stadium crowd.
The theatricality of it is very visible to us now. Not only is the scaffold a stage set, the audience at Tyburn, anyway, was arranged in tiers round benches for which they had to pay. And the melodrama is enacted also in the person of the hangman, who's masked, deplored, booed, hissed as the villain of the piece, of course. especially of the victim of the scaffold as a working man's hero, as Jack was. And it's the quest for sensation, for emblems of this awesome event, I think, that leads to the purchase of inches or feet of hangman's ropes, which are ways in which the hangman made part of his living.
The rope was thrown over the crossbar. The noose tightened around his neck. And Jack Shephard started the slow process of being strangled to death in public. If Jack's final escape plan was going to work, he had to try and survive the gradual choking until he was cut down.
You died more quickly if you were a heavy, weighty person. The throttling would be more immediate. So a very slight figure like Jack, 5'4" in height, with a boyish body, his great gift, of course, as an escape artist, a light figure like him would die very, very slowly.
All hell broke loose. Someone leaped from the crowd and cut him down. There was chaos. The crowd surged because they mistakenly thought Jack was being taken away, that his body would be used for medical experiments. A fight over Jack's body ensued. In the mayhem, Appleby's men tried in vain to pull him away from the crowd, but they would not let him go. Even if Jack was alive when he was cut down, it took so long for the mob to be controlled that he certainly died as his body was wrenched back and forth. He was buried that night at St. Martin in the Fields. The crowds wouldn't disperse until they'd seen him safely in the ground. After all, he was their hero.
I loved the way that Jack Shephard was an embodiment of a kind of defiance against the way society was. He didn't want to live in the way that his life had been mapped out for him by society, and so he threw off all the conventions that he felt constricted by, and he may have died for it, but he still managed to pack a whole load of excitement and exhilaration and rebellion and defiance into those few years that he was doing what he did.
What amazing difficulties has he overcome? What astonishing things has he performed? And all for the sake of a stinking, miserable carcass that was hardly worth the hanging. Oh, that ye were all like Jack Shephard. Mistake ye not, my brethren, I don't mean in a carnal, but in a spiritual sense. What a shame it would be if we should not think it worth our while to take as much pains and to employ as many deep thoughts to save our souls as he has done to preserve his body.
Bendy, warped, bold, stunning. Frank Gehry's amazing buildings, Profile of an Architect. True Stories, Tuesdays at 10. And next, when a gay man's beaten to death, prejudice seeps out from the force in tonight's episode of The Closer.